Globalization is the word of the moment. You've got to understand we live in a global world. And that's true, but is it all that new? You see, empires were a form of globalization. When I was born in 1925, a quarter of the world's population was governed from London. That was a form of globalization. We controlled the world. We therefore got cheap raw materials, and it provided a market for our goods. It produced them and had to buy them in the colonies because we were in charge. But what's happened now is on a much, much bigger scale, because clearly with new technology, industry and banking become international in the sense that they operate all over the world, and all the economies of the world are closely connected, as we've seen from the recent example of the crisis. China and India are affected by what's happening in Wall Street and so on. So then you have to ask yourself the question, are you prepared to let the world be governed by multinational corporations and unaccountable organizations like the World Trade Organization, the IMF, the World Bank, who are not elected by anybody? Or do you want to get control of them? And that moves you forward, as inevitably has to happen, to the idea of what democratic control can you have of the world in which we live. And it is very interesting that it was the Industrial Revolution in Britain in the late 18th and early 19th century that made it possible for us to get a democratic control of our society. That's how the vote came, because people demanded some control of the economy. Local government came that way. And we have now to make as big a bolder leap of imagination in thinking about the world, because the Prime Minister went to Washington in November 2008, and he said we've got to have some international institutions. Quite right, but who controls them? That's the question. It's the basic question. And we have got now to think of some form of world government. Now, if you were to draw a parallel between the need for a world government and the way we got national democratic government, you'll see government has to reflect the population. So if we were to revive or revitalize or rebuild the United Nations, which we'll have to do, it would have to be on the basis of equality of representation, as we have in constituencies, all have roughly the same population. So that would mean that China would have 2 billion votes at the UN, as compared to having 1 vote like Luxembourg at the moment. India would have 2 billion votes. We would have about 70 million votes. The Americans would have 300 million votes. And that is something inconceivable in the minds of those who run the world, because it would mean sharing power with all these people who they would regard as ignorant and poor, and what right have they got to have any say in the wealth we create. But that has to happen. And thinking about that, you have to have some dream in the back of your mind. Utopia is mocked. People said it when women wanted to vote. It's a really utopian idea. But out of utopian ideas comes the drive. That gives me a rest every hour. Harold Wilson once said, without a vision, the nation perishes. It's a very profound remark. You have to have some idea of what you'd like. And that idea develops in the minds of people, and as that idea becomes more developed and more shared, then the demand for it comes about. And the same is true of Europe on a smaller scale. Europe, which we've all got to cooperate with our neighbours, quite right, but Europe is run by commissioners. We don't elect, can't remove. They don't have to listen to us. It's only half Europe. It doesn't include Russia. And you've got to have a new view of Europe. You've got to have a new view of the world government, because the United Nations, which was a brilliant concept at the end of the Second World War, was based on retaining vetoes and power for the countries that had won the war. And it excluded the colonies. They weren't even in the early UN, then they came out as independent countries. And this process just requires imagination. And if you talk about it, you have to present it to people as a perspective towards which we've got to move. And I think if you do that, there's quite a lot of support, because the environment is an international issue. If one country pollutes, the national frontier doesn't protect that pollution from moving to the next country. So the environment is a big issue. World poverty and the consequences of it. World weapons. How can you have a world where the arms trade is completely uncontrolled? I mean, we wouldn't allow in one country weapons to be sold to anybody, not at all. You have some control. And I think thinking of a world where the arms trade is controlled, where multinational corporations are controlled, where some basic health and safety regulations apply wherever a company operates, instead of allowing them to exploit the poor to get cheap goods to sell in the supermarkets for us. I think these ideas are not so strange, provided they're brought into focus. And so I'm an optimist about that too, but it's a dream. And without a vision, a nation perishes, said Harold Wilson. And he was right. It was quite a profound thing to say. And I think it'll have to happen very quickly, because if it doesn't, then the poor will rise and attack the rich. The possibility of a revolution of that kind is bound to come about, because poverty now and famine are not a million miles away. They're just in the global village in which we live. So our whole perception of how politics should develop and what the objective should be, is it just for profit or is it for need? And they say that wealth trickles down. Actually, wealth bubbles up, and the people at the top are rolling in cash, the bonuses and all the multi-millionaires with their yachts. They're the ones who are benefiting from the status quo. We have to point out there's a better system that would spread the benefit more widely. The only real wealth is people and land and what lies under the land, copper and oil. And the control of our own resources is a fundamental question, and that's not new. You see, when Lloyd George was elected to Parliament, he sang the land song. The land, the land, the land on which we stand. Why should we be paupers with the ballot in our hand? God gave the land to the people. And then you see the whole historical process in a new way. You see, the first privatization were the Enclosure Acts. They took the common land and gave it to rich farmers. And that's why people are now dispossessed, because they didn't have access to the land. And all these things which come from history have a relevance now if you think about them on a different scale, a world scale. And I'm an internationalist. I don't believe in globalization. I'm an internationalist.